Mr. President, I want to talk a little about the bill that's coming over from the House that would require the Senate to, surprise, have a budget. I know the law already requires the Senate to have a budget, but apparently that law wasn't good enough for us to have a budget for the last 3 years, and I'm supportive of the House decision to do that. In fact, I'm supportive of almost any discussion that requires us to talk about what we're going to do about spending. You know, if you have been living outside your means, if you can't pay your bills and you go to the credit counselor is highly unlikely to say, well, your problem is you just need another credit card. The credit counselor is going to say you need to figure out how you're going to pay your bills. That includes things like having a budget. It includes things like figuring out what you're spending money on that you that you can stop spending money on. And Mr. President, that's what we need to do, and it's what we need to do with a budget. Somehow, in the face of unprecedented spending and record federal debt, the President and even Senate Democrats for a few years now have been saying that in Washington all we need to do is just get another credit card. Our problem, I hear, is not a spending problem, it's a health care problem, or it's a whatever kind of problem it is. It's clearly a spending problem. There's no doubt that Washington is living outside its means. The federal debt has skyrocketed to a record $16.5 trillion. President Obama's first term added almost $6 trillion to that total, and there's no reason to believe that we've done anything to slow down that spending and debt path that we've been on. Meanwhile, it's been 1,360 days since the majority in the Senate and the Senate itself managed to pass a budget. In fact, I think during that 1,316 days, we haven't even had the Budget Committee report a budget out for the Senate to vote on. Vice President Biden last summer said, "Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value." Well, let's find out what we value. Let's find out what the majority in the Senate values. And when the Vice President talked about showing the budget, he was talking about the Republican budget, because there actually was one. The Republican House had passed a budget. In fact, Mr. President, the Senate and the House both passed a budget every single year from the passage of the Budget Control Act in the mid-1970s until 2010. And in 2010, both the House and the Senate, the House with the Speaker Pelosi and the Senate with the current majority, said, we don't care what the law says, we're not going to pass a budget. That lasted 1 year in the House, but it's now lasted 3 years in the Senate. 2011 and 12, the House came back and passed a budget. The Republicans have voted for serious budgets that make tough choices. And even those choices were choices that made us go out and explain what we were for. And of course, that's exactly what the Vice President was talking about when he says, show me your budget, I'll show you your values. There was only one side that had a budget. So that was a pretty harmless position from his point of view for the Vice President to be in. Because he was saying, let's look at the budget the other guys have put on the table, because we haven't got one on the table. We've not said what we're for. The Senate Democrats have ignored the law, ignored their legal obligation to pass a budget, while House Republicans have now said that the Senate should either pass a budget or not be paid. And I agree with that. It is a fundamental step toward planning. The second step is to vote on appropriations bills. We haven't voted on a single appropriations bill in the Senate in over a year. You don't have a budget, so there's no plan to try to get spending under control, and then you don't vote on how you're going to spend the money in any way other than some big continuing resolution, which basically is just a bill that says we're going to continue spending money like we've been spending money. And here are the 2 or 3 exceptions, but we're not going to have the debate that I think the Senate needs to have. And frankly, Mr. President, I believe with our new Appropriations Chairman, Barbara Mikulski, I think she's going to be insisting that we bring appropriations bills to the floor, and I think that's a good thing. The failure to have a Senate budget has too often been described as just a minor procedural matter. Senator Schumer, who explained recently, said, well, the Democrats did have a budget because there was a budget that came out of the sequester agreement in mid-2011. Now, never mind that the Senate hadn't had a budget that spring or the spring before that, or that the parliamentarians said that the sequester deal wasn't a budget. Somehow coming up with one number was supposedly good enough to be a budget. That's like if you sat around your kitchen table and had a discussion about how you're going to spend your money. Here's how the discussion would go. Okay, I think we ought to spend X amount of money. That's the meeting. We've just decided that's what we're going to do, and that's somehow the budget. And particularly when X amount of money didn't relate at all to the amount of money coming into your family, nobody believes that would make sense. We'll see whether Senator Schumer's words this weekend will produce a budget. The House has acted. The President says he wants the debt ceiling increase. Hopefully the majority has decided to pass a budget. The new budget chairman, Senator Murray, said yesterday that her committee will draft a budget. Now let's let the Senate produce a budget. Let's have a budget drawn up. Let's have a budget debated. Let's figure out what our plans are. Budgets lay out plans, and we'll see if a budget that a majority in the Senate would vote for will pass the straight-face test with the American people. We'll see if this is just another budget that says, okay, here's the amount of money we'd like to spend. It has no relationship to the amount of money we have. Let's let that be our budget. The people will no longer tolerate, I'm convinced, the amount of debt and taxes that the spending plan would require. But for them to really think about that, they have to have a spending plan. And I am grateful that the House passed legislation that says we have to have that plan. When the majority in the Senate, Democrats in the Senate, have a budget, we'll see how they feel about continuing to attack the budget that the House has been willing to come up with for the last 2 Congresses. Right now, they can talk about the cuts that Republicans in the House talked about, and there are no Senate cuts because there is no Senate budget. And let's have an apples-to-apples comparison. Let's really compare what Republicans in the House would do compared to what Democrats in the Senate would do, and figure out what our plan needs to be. It's often said that when you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And not having a budget is sort of the entry level failing to plan. We've failed to do the first thing you would do if you were going to have a plan, if you were going to get your spending under control. My Republican colleagues and I in the Senate have, even though there wasn't a budget committee product, have actually found ways to vote for and support the Republican passed ballot in the House. And of course, we paid the price for that. People would be out there saying, well, here's what you wanted to do about this program, and here's what you want to do about that program. But we're going to move quickly from where, rather than just attacking one side who has a plan, let's talk about what the 2 plans are and see what the American people want to do. President Obama and our friends in the Senate should work with Republicans in the Senate to cut spending, pass a budget in a transparent way. Republicans have been willing to do that. Democrats maybe are willing to join in that. And if they are, Americans can begin to see more than a last-minute backroom deal. I'm tired of seeing this planned crisis, one right after another, and I've got a feeling that the people I work for are even more tired of it than I am. A divided government is a good opportunity to make tough choices. The president will never have more political capital than he has right now. Let's take those two things together. Let's see what that formula would produce. Divided government, Republicans and Democrats both have to take responsibility. A president with maximum political capital could equal a good and long-term result. I hope that the president and the majority in the Senate will get serious about working together and solve the problems that we face as a country. I look forward to being part of that, and I am appreciative that the House of Representatives has passed legislation that appears to have forced the Senate to do its job on a budget for the first time in 4 years.